Hello again. So it's been about 5 months since I managed to get an update on the EWWI worm bin. EWWI stands for everything wrong with it. And the reason for that is because I had a meltdown with the laptop, which broke, and I also managed to break an external hard drive where I transferred a ton of files to. So I lost literally thousands of clips, not just related to EWWI, but to the allotment, the back garden, things that were growing, seedling updates, a long-term project I'm working on, experiments I was doing. They're all gone to internet heaven. But anyhow, I put together what clips I could. This is a recent video of the state of the bin as it is pretty much today. You'll see that it's taking a bit of an effort to actually get through the bedding, and those little springtails, the white dots there, they're springtails. That will tell you the bin is very wet. Now you'll see the reason why it's so wet in a couple of seconds. There's a remnant of an apple with a worm in it. So that's going to give you a big clue. After the last update, I didn't actually feed the bin for about 2 months. 6 weeks to 2 months, and the reason for that was my intention was to show you that as long as you've got sufficient bedding, there's the apples, big clue, as long as you've got sufficient bedding, the worms will be absolutely fine. Now, since the neighbour started collecting our windfall apples, this is the no rules worm bin, so I'm switching between the two because I do have some clips of the no rules worm bin, and I did lose them because they were actually still on my phone. So there you go. This is how I fed the no rules worm bin. I literally dumped bags of windfall apples into the bin, and you can see there's a lovely carpet of vermicomposted bedding there, which is essentially the composted apples. They seem to have been systematically working from the bottom up, and I did pretty much a similar thing with the EWWI bin, the everything wrong with it bin. I didn't feed it for about 2 months, the point being to show you that as long as there is plenty of bedding, because one of the questions that you see all the time in forums is, or fora I should say to be more correct, is I'm going away for 2 weeks, will my worms be okay? I'm going away for 2 months, will my worms be okay? In that situation, I wouldn't actually feed anything green to the bin. What I'd use as bedding in the EWWI was horse manure. So if you can get lots of brown, inverted commas, bedding, or something like horse manure into the bin before you go, with maybe a small amount of scraps, you're going to reduce any possibility of the bin overheating, becoming sour, the worms leaving, and they'll have tons of food and it won't get too wet. So that was the point of that. Unfortunately, I couldn't show you. And after the 2 months where the bin was not fed and the worms were fine, I then only fed the bin these apples. So these apples were split between the no rules worm bin, which you can see here, and the EWWI bin. And the worms love them. They absolutely love them. They thrived on these apples. You saw the way I dumped the apples in. I didn't add any lime, I didn't add any grit, I didn't add any browns, I didn't add anything else. They were literally just dumped in. And this is what I frequently found when I went to go check up, is you would literally find only the outer skin of the apples, where the worms had eaten them all, seemed like, from the inside out. They seem to be in there. Now these apples are quite acidic. I'll show you the measurements in a second. I measured the malic acid. What I did was I squeezed some of the apples because the juice coming out will be high in malic acid. So as the apples break down and they release their juice or water content. That's going to be very high in malic acid. So I squeezed a few apples and I measured the pH using those little pH strips as around 3.5. So all of the liquid leaking into that bin and the bedding from the apples was very acidic, a pH of around 3.5. And you could see that the worms are absolutely thriving and loving it. So the acidity is not putting them off at all. And again, no lime added, no calcium added, nothing for grit. And the worms are absolutely loving it. Unfortunately, they've pretty much come to an end now. So they're going to be a bit disappointed at the next feed. But you can see how beautiful the vermicomposted apples are, how fine it is. And everywhere I move the apples, swarms of worms underneath them and in them. And there's a bit of a closer look at the worms, healthy, thriving, active, loving it. So I didn't obviously put that amount of apples into the EWWI bin, but the EWWI bin was seriously overfed with apples. So proportionately there was the same excessive amount of apple feed added to the EWWI bin. And what I was finding in the EWWI bin was exactly the same as what you're looking at here. The worms dived into the apples and just literally could not get enough of them. The other interesting thing to note in both the EWWI bin and in this no rules worm bin is that when I measured the pH of the bedding, it came out at around 7.5. Now, if you remember back through some of the I think it was probably the first or second video I made with the EWWI bin, I measured the pH. Oh no, it was after I gave the bin its first feed, that's when I did it, yeah. I measured the pH of the bedding and it came out around 7.5. So after an extensive period of only feeding it acidic apples, and we know the pH of the liquid draining into the bedding was around the 3.5 mark. I mean, that obviously changes slightly over time and all the rest of it, but it was without doubt extremely acidic, and it was fed this menu for a consistent period of time, and it did not change the pH of the bedding. When I measured the pH of the bedding in the EWWI bin, it was still 7.5. So this raises a question, and always did raise a question in my head around this advice which we're given. And again, I'm not saying don't do it, and I'm not saying don't follow it, and I'm not saying it's wrong. But for me personally, I've always questioned why when, you know, if you watch videos or go on fora, you'll see that people will say, oh, you need to add some lime, or you need to add some calcium carbonate or ground up eggshells to prevent the bin from becoming acidic. But we know that soils have a natural buffering ability, and I always thought, why wouldn't it be the same in a worm bin? And it appears from the little experiment I did here, that is the case, because in neither the EWWI bin or the no rules worm bin, the pH of the bedding changed. Now that was just showing you the pH at 3.5 of the apples, and that's the bedding. between 7 and 8. So I'm satisfied for myself that in both bins the pH of the bedding did not change. And therefore, I mean, what else are you going to do with, and I've stressed this all along, and I really don't want to be any misunderstanding about this. I am not saying never add lime or calcium carbonate or some sort of ground up eggshells or whatever, that there's absolutely no need for it. As I said, either in a post somewhere or in one of the videos, what else are you going to do with your ground up eggshells? It's a perfect use for them. But what I'm trying to reassure people is that if for some reason you don't have that type of thing, you don't have ground up eggshells or lime or calcium, don't worry about adding, you know, if you're adding small amounts of acidic feed, it's not going to affect the worms, it's not going to affect the bedding. You saw the worms in huge squirms of worms inside the apples themselves. So even the acidic cores of the apples didn't affect the worms. They weren't put off. They didn't get protein poisoning. They didn't leave the bin. So that's the whole point of this series, really, is to try and reassure, especially people new to worm farming, that there's an awful lot of stuff you read on the internet and see in videos and all the rest of it. And to me, it creates a worry. And it puts people off getting into composting with worms, because you think if you forget to add grit, if you forget to add, you know, some sort of lime or whatever, you've now soured the bin, you've killed all your worms, they're all going to leave. And that is simply not the case. So this is what this series is about. It's not saying the rules and the guidance and the advice is wrong. It's simply saying, well, it's saying, number one, question everything. Number two, if you can, test it out for yourself. And number three, don't worry. The worms will be fine. As I like to say, they've managed 600 million years without any help from us whatsoever. They will be absolutely fine if you don't add a bit of grit. Now, the thing about the grit is, neither bin, there is eggshells, but not ground up, just broken up eggshells in the No Rules worm bin. There is none in this. So I purposely set out to make sure that nothing that even resembled grit could be added or was added to this bin. And yet the worms are fine, because it's always been my contention, the worms don't need us to add grit. They must be able to use whatever it is they're eating in their bedding or in their environment, suitable stuff for grit. They must be able to use it. And there's always been a lot of questions in my head around the use of grit. I mean, for example, does anybody know how long grit lasts? How long do the worms hold the grit in their gizzard? I saw one study, and again I've lost it because I don't have a laptop anymore, but I'm sure if you search for it you'll find it. There was one study done with hens, and I think they held, one hen lasted a year using the same grit that it had they allowed hens to have access to grit, and then made sure all the feed stuff after a certain point in time contained no grit, and they didn't have any access to grit. And a year later, one of the hens still had grit in its gizzard. So, I mean, nobody can tell you how long a worm can use grit for. Nobody can tell you exactly what it is the worms use as grit. And if you look in the piles of horse manure or whatever, there's always tons of worms there, but there's nobody adding ground up eggshells to piles of horse manure. Anyhow, these are escapees, not necessarily from the EWWI bin, but maybe from the tower, they may be from heaven knows where. The earlier clip, the end of the earlier clip was, I just filmed along the edge. You could see the castings there. So the worms are leaving the bin. And again, it's not something I worry about. They're not leaving in huge numbers. Those worms under that bag, like I say, are probably from 2 or 3 different sources. The bin has been exposed a lot earlier, prior to these clips, and exposed to rain as well. I have a clip which I'll put in at the end. That was on my phone. That probably encouraged them to leave. But I never worry about worms leaving the bin. This is why the bin is the way it is, because if something does go wrong with this, I don't want the worms to die or be injured in any way. That was an old sock, obviously, I threw in more recently, once the apples stopped. What was I saying? Oh yeah, worms leaving. They will leave. And no matter how good your bin is, there'll always be some worms that will go adventuring. And again, it's not something to worry about. As long as it's only a small number of worms, it does, because a few worms leave your bin, it's not an indication that there's anything wrong with your bin. Your bin is almost certainly fine. There are delinquent worms. I'm going to give this a dry feed now. I ran these porridge oats through the coffee grinder to make it into more like flour. I don't want to add any more wet stuff to the bin, because the bedding, as you saw, it's very, very wet. I could add some cardboard. I have cardboard ready to go, but I want to give them a feed. I have no more apples left. They're all gone. And I don't have too many scraps, to be honest, either. So I thought I'll give these something a little bit different. And I just ran some porridge oats through the coffee grinder. So that's what these are being fed now. Yeah, like I was saying, if a few worms leave, it's not a big issue. I leave stuff all around the back garden for them to congregate under. So there's bits of cardboard, there's piles of leaves. Under all of the external bins, I leave piles of leaves and cardboard. So any worms leaving the bin, that's where they'll end up. That plastic bag is about 5 feet away from where the EWWI bin currently is. And it's quite close to where the worm tower is. And there's another small bin off to the right by the fence, which I don't think has ever appeared in any videos. So they could be. I'm guessing that's a mix from all of those bins. And again, nothing I worry about. There's that guy doesn't look too happy, but the coating of ground up oats is not going to do them any good. But because the bin is so wet, they'll just tunnel through, and that'll clear off their skin. That's a remnant of an apple, I think, with a few worms still in there. So there's still a few tiny little bits of apples left. And as you can see, worms stuck right into the centre of it. Loving it. But unfortunately, that's the end of it. It's an annual event, getting fed all these windfall apples. But it's coming to an end now. So that's an update on sort of where we stand. I'm still recording on my phone. I'm within days of getting a better tech setup, so hopefully in the next few weeks I can get back to producing my usual badly put together videos, which will be a bit better than this. But that's the EWWI bin as it stands around the end of September, beginning of October. It's in its short life, what has happened to it? It's been frozen. It's been exposed to the elements. You'll see I found a little clip which I'm going to put on at the end of this now. It's been exposed to the elements. It's been used as a table. Yeah, it's been frozen. It's been underfed. It's been overfed. It's never had any grit added. It's never had any lime or calcium or ground up eggshells added. I suspect actually that the worms, like I was saying about them using whatever is to hand or whatever is in their environment or bedding or food source, they're actually able to utilize that as the grit that they need. And I expect that these ground up oats will actually provide some grit now inadvertently to the worms. So it's been through a lot, this bin, and you can see it's still functioning. I've still got worms. That bedding is almost completely finished now. I really need to start properly feeding it. So I've got a few more things planned for the bin before the end of the year. These are the clips now that I found. I think this is around May, June. It was left outside and used as a table, and it wasn't brought in when it rained. There's just a few sheets of cardboard. Those thick sheets of cardboard did an incredible job of keeping the rain out. And of course, you know, the pounding and the change in air pressure, the vibration of all that, that will have encouraged some of the worms to leave as well. But again, you can see it sitting on top of bags. There's other cardboard there. I'm not worried about it. That's where any worms that left at that point in time would have ended up. Anyhow, this is a longer video than I normally make. I was just trying to get some bits together. I desperately wanted to get a EWWI worm bin update out. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, thanks for watching. Bye for now.